They were supposed to leave that morning. Roger and Margaret Pratt had everything ready. The steel-hulled cutter built to cross oceans sat waiting at a commercial dock in St. Lucia. Magnetic Attraction. 41 feet of carefully engineered survival. But they didn't leave. A customs delay. A missing form. One more night. Just after midnight, something happened on that boat. By dawn, Roger Pratt was dead. His wife was bleeding and alone. And 4 men had disappeared into the port town of Vieux-Fort. What should have been a routine stop became a crime scene. What should have been justice became a years-long collapse. Arrests were made. Evidence was collected. And then the case fell apart in ways no one expected. This is the dark story of the Magnetic Attraction murder. The couple who sold everything to sail the world. The boat built to survive storms, but not what came aboard that night. The bureaucratic error that kept them in the wrong place. The evidence that vanished. And the question that still haunts the cruising community. How safe are you when you're just passing through? We're going to examine the dream, the delay, the attack, the aftermath, and why this case reveals something deeper about vulnerability at sea. What really happened that night in Vieux-Fort? And why did justice never come? Roger Pratt was 62 years old when he died. He was beaten, thrown overboard, and left to drown in the black water off St. Lucia, while his wife searched for him in the dark, calling his name into the void. The men who killed him climbed aboard just after midnight. They didn't sneak. They didn't creep. They boarded like they owned the place. Because in that moment, they did. But here's the part that makes it worse. Roger and Margaret weren't supposed to be there. They were supposed to leave that morning. The boat was ready. The route was plotted. They'd already said their goodbyes. But a bureaucratic delay, a customs holdup, a piece of paperwork that wasn't filed correctly, kept them moored for one more night. One more night in Vieux-Fort, a commercial port on the southern tip of St. Lucia, far from the tourist marinas, far from the security patrols, far from anyone who might have heard Margaret screaming. The sea didn't kill Roger Pratt. Waiting did. There's a phrase in the sailing community, blue water dreaming. It refers to the moment when you stop thinking about weekends on the bay and start thinking about crossing oceans. When you stop saying, someday, and start saying, next year. When you trade the spreadsheet for the chart and the office for the cockpit. It's a romantic idea, and like most romantic ideas, it's rooted in escape. Roger Pratt understood escape. Not in the dramatic sense. He wasn't running from debt or scandal or a failed marriage. He was running from something quieter. From the predictability of it all. From the feeling that every year looked like the last, and the next would look the same. He'd spent decades as an engineer, solving problems, building systems, making things work. He was good at it. But good at something doesn't mean you want to do it forever. So he and Margaret made a plan. They would buy a boat, a proper offshore cruiser, and they would sail it around the world. Not quickly, not recklessly, but thoroughly. They would take their time. See the places other people only read about. Live on their own terms, on their own schedule, with no one to answer to but the wind and the tide. It's the fantasy that fills the boat shows every winter, the dream that keeps the marine industry alive. Sail up, sail away, live free. And for some people, it works. They do it. They leave. They send postcards from French Polynesia and updates from the Indian Ocean. Their blogs get thousands of followers. Their lives become aspirational content. But for every success story, there are 100 that stall out. Boats that never leave the marina. Couples who realize halfway through the refit that they don't actually like each other in confined spaces. Dreams that dissolve the moment the engine breaks down 3 days from land, and no one is coming to help. Roger and Margaret didn't stall out. They did the work. They bought the boat, learned the systems, sailed the miles. They didn't just dream it, they lived it. And that makes what happened to them so much worse. Magnetic Attraction was a 41-foot steel cutter. Not aluminum. Not fiberglass. Steel. The kind of hull that doesn't flex in heavy seas. The kind that can take a grounding without shattering. The kind of boat you build when you're not planning to stay close to shore. Steel boats are heavier. They're slower. They require more maintenance. You have to manage rust, check welds, keep up with the paint. But they're also tougher. They absorb impact. They survive collisions that would crack a fiberglass hull clean through. If you're planning to sail into the unknown, into places where help is days away and repair yards don't exist, you build in steel. Roger didn't just buy this boat, he rebuilt it. He knew every system, every through hull, every wire. He'd spent years preparing it for offshore work. The engine was reliable. The sails were new. The electronics were redundant. He had backup systems for the backup systems. He didn't leave anything to chance. Because that's what engineers do. They plan for failure. They anticipate problems. They build in margins of safety. Roger understood that the ocean would test him. That storms would come. That equipment would break. That things would go wrong at the worst possible time. So he prepared. He over-prepared. But you can't engineer your way out of human violence. You can't build redundancy into trust. And you can't anticipate the moment when 4 men decide your boat is worth more than your life. Margaret Pratt didn't grow up around boats. She wasn't a sailor by background. But she trusted Roger. And more than that, she shared the dream. Not the technical dream of waypoints and weather windows, but the emotional one. The dream of freedom, of partnership, of building a life that wasn't dictated by schedules and obligations. This wasn't Roger's midlife crisis that she tolerated. This was their shared vision. She learned to navigate. She learned to handle the sails. She stood night watches. She managed the galley, the provisioning, the endless small tasks that keep a cruising boat functional. She became competent. Not just a passenger, a crew. And that's important to understand, because when people hear this story, they sometimes imagine a wealthy couple on a luxury yacht, playing at adventure. They weren't. Magnetic Attraction was a working boat. It was comfortable, yes, well-equipped. But it wasn't a palace. It was a tool, a home. A carefully maintained system that required constant attention. The cruising lifestyle is often romanticized as passive. You drop anchor in paradise and drink sundowners while the locals bring you fresh fish. But the reality is labor. You're fixing things constantly. You're managing water, managing fuel, managing waste. You're dealing with officials, with language barriers, with supply chains that don't exist. You're navigating not just the ocean, but the bureaucracy of every port you enter. And sometimes that bureaucracy kills you. St. Lucia is beautiful. That's what the tourism board will tell you. And it's true. The Pitons rising out of the sea like ancient monuments. The rainforest thick and green and endless. The beaches, the bays, the trade winds that make the whole island feel like a postcard. But St. Lucia is also complicated. It's a small island nation trying to balance tourism with commerce, tradition with development, security with accessibility. And like most Caribbean islands, it has pockets of wealth and pockets of desperation. Sometimes those pockets sit right next to each other. Vieux Fort is on the southern tip of the island. It's not where the cruise ships dock. It's not where the resorts are. It's a commercial port, a working port, a place where cargo moves, where fishing boats tie up, where the infrastructure is functional but not polished. It's not dangerous in the way a war zone is dangerous, but it's not secure in the way a marina is secure. It exists in a gray zone, a transitional space, and transitional spaces are where bad things happen, because no one owns them. No one patrols them. No one is responsible. Roger and Margaret arrived in Vieux Fort in early January 2014. They'd been cruising the Caribbean for months. They'd stopped in Grenada, Martinique, the Grenadines. They'd anchored in protected bays and tied up in tourist marinas. They'd met other cruisers, shared meals, traded tips. This was supposed to be a routine stop. A quick check-in with customs, a night at anchor, then on to the next island. But the paperwork didn't clear. There was a problem with the customs declaration. Maybe a form wasn't filled out correctly. Maybe the official wasn't available. Maybe it was just bureaucracy being bureaucracy. Whatever the reason, they couldn't leave. So they stayed. One more night. That's all it was supposed to be. The anchoring itself was unremarkable. Magnetic Attraction sat in the bay like dozens of other cruising boats before it. The anchor bit into the sand. The boat swung gently on the road. The engine was shut down. The sails were furled. Everything was secure. Cruisers talk about the concept of situational awareness. Knowing where you are, who's around you, what the risks are. Roger and Margaret had that awareness. They knew Vieux-Fort wasn't a tourist marina. They knew it was grittier, less patrolled. But it wasn't considered a high-risk anchorage. Other cruisers had anchored there. The harbor was used. It wasn't abandoned. And that's the trap. Because transitional zones feel safer than they are. They're not empty enough to trigger alarm, but they're not secure enough to provide protection. You're visible, but you're also isolated. You're close to shore, but help is far away. You're in a limbo. Night fell. The lights of Vieux-Fort flickered on the shore. The town wasn't dark, but it wasn't bright either. The kind of ambient glow that makes you think civilization is close, even when it isn't. Roger and Margaret settled in. They'd done this 1,000 times before. Anchor watch, dinner, books, bed. The rhythm of cruising life. There's a phrase in the cruising community. Just one more night. It's said casually, almost dismissively. Plans change, weather shifts, repairs take longer than expected. You adjust. You say it without thinking. Just one more night. But sometimes, one more night is all it takes. The boat rocked gently. The water was calm. The trade winds had eased. It was a quiet night. The kind of night where you sleep deeply, where the boat feels safe, where you forget that steel hulls and solid locks don't stop determined men. Roger and Margaret went to bed. They didn't lock the companionway. Most cruisers don't. You lock it when you're away from the boat, maybe. But when you're on board, sleeping below, the idea of locking yourself in feels claustrophobic. You want to be able to move quickly if something goes wrong, if the anchor drags, if the weather changes, if you need to get topside fast. That's the cruiser's dilemma. Security versus access. Safety versus response time. You can't have both. Midnight came, then passed. The town lights dimmed. The water was black. The boat was dark. And then, without warning, without stealth, without hesitation, 4 men climbed aboard. They didn't knock. They didn't call out. They came with purpose, with violence, with the assumption that the boat and everything on it was theirs for the taking. Roger woke to the sound of footsteps, heavy, fast. Not the footsteps of someone lost or confused. The footsteps of someone who had already decided. He came topside, not to fight, not to be a hero, but to protect Margaret, to put himself between her and whatever was happening. And that's when it started. The customs office in Vieux-Fort wasn't much to look at. A low concrete building near the commercial docks, painted in the faded colors of Caribbean bureaucracy. Inside, a few desks, a filing cabinet, forms printed on paper that had been photocopied so many times the text was barely legible. The kind of place where efficiency goes to die. Roger had dealt with customs in 12 countries by this point. He knew the drill. Arrive, present your papers, wait. Sometimes it took an hour. Sometimes it took a day. You learned patience. You learned that frustration didn't speed anything up. You learned to smile, to be polite, to accept that you were operating on someone else's timeline. But this delay was different. This wasn't just slow processing. This was a problem. Something about their paperwork didn't match. Maybe it was the previous port's exit stamp. Maybe it was a discrepancy in the vessel documentation. Maybe it was something trivial, something that could have been resolved with a phone call. But it wasn't resolved. And so they waited. Margaret stayed on the boat. There was no point both of them going ashore to stand in a hot office. Roger would handle it. He always did. She spent the morning organizing the cabin, checking supplies, running through the mental checklist that never really ends on a cruising boat. Water levels, battery charge, propane, the small maintenance tasks that accumulate like dust. By noon, Roger returned. No clearance. The official needed to verify something. He'd have an answer tomorrow. Tomorrow. That word that means everything and nothing in the Caribbean. Tomorrow could mean the next day. It could mean next week. It could mean whenever the official felt like dealing with it. So they stayed. They weren't anchored in the bay anymore. They'd been directed to tie up at a concrete dock closer to the commercial port. Not a marina, not a yacht club. A working dock. The kind of place where fishing boats offload their catch and cargo ships wait for fuel. The kind of place that smells like diesel and fish guts and low tide. It wasn't ideal, but it was temporary. Just one more night. View Fort exists in the shadow of Huon-Ora International Airport. You can hear the jets taking off, see them climbing out over the ocean, carrying tourists to other islands, to other dreams. The town itself is working class. Not poor, but not wealthy. The kind of place where people make a living, where kids play in the streets, where the economy runs on fishing and shipping and small commerce. But like most port towns, it has edges. Places where the streetlights don't reach. Places where unemployment sits heavy and opportunities are thin. Places where young men gather and wait and watch the boats come in. Cruising boats are targets. That's not paranoia. It's fact. They represent wealth, mobility, freedom. They're insured. They're expendable. And most importantly, they're vulnerable. No security team. No armed guards. Just a retired couple with a VHF radio and a flare gun. The super yachts that cruise the Caribbean don't anchor in places like View 4. They stay in protected marinas with security patrols and gated docks. They have crew who rotate watches through the night. They have cameras, alarms, panic rooms. They're fortresses. But the mom and pop cruisers, the couples like Roger and Margaret, they're out here alone. They anchor in bays that seem safe. They tie up at docks because an official told them to. They trust that civilization, even rough-edged civilization, offers some baseline of security. And usually it does. Most cruisers sail for years without incident. They trade stories about sketchy anchorages and close calls, but they come home. They write blogs about how the dangers are exaggerated, how the locals are friendly, how the risks are overblown by people who've never left the dock. Until the night they're wrong. The dock where Magnetic Attraction was tied up wasn't abandoned. There were other boats nearby, fishing vessels mostly, a few small cargo boats, the kind of working fleet that operates in the margins, moving goods between islands, catching fish for local markets. There were people around during the day. Not many, but enough. At night, though, the dock emptied out. The fishermen went home. The cargo crews dispersed. The lights stayed on, but dimly. Just enough to see shapes, not details. Just enough to give the illusion of activity without the reality of presence. Roger and Margaret ate dinner in the cockpit. They'd cooked something simple. Pasta, maybe? Or rice and beans? The kind of meal you make when you're tired and just want to eat and clean up and be done. They watched the sunset over the Pythons in the distance. They talked about the next leg of the journey, about where they'd go once the paperwork cleared, about the anchorages they'd heard about from other cruisers. There's a particular kind of peace that comes with being on a boat at anchor, or, in this case, tied to a dock. A kind of enclosure. The world narrows down to the boat itself. Everything outside becomes backdrop. You're aware of it, but you're not part of it. You're in your own small universe, rocking gently, contained. That peace is deceptive, because you're not actually separate. You're connected to the land by a dock line. You're visible from shore. You're accessible. Anyone who wants to can walk down that dock and step aboard. And that's exactly what happened. It's hard to know exactly when Roger and Margaret went to bed. Probably around 10, maybe 11. Cruisers tend to keep early hours. You wake with the sun. You sleep when it's dark. There's no television to keep you up, no emails to check, no distractions. Just the rhythm of light and dark, wake and sleep. Magnetic Attraction sat quiet at the dock. The boat was locked down for the night. Hatches closed, lines secured. The cabin lights were off. From shore, it would have looked like any other boat. Still, dark, asleep. But someone was watching. Someone had noticed the boat earlier in the day, had seen the foreign flag, had seen the older couple moving around the deck, had calculated what might be inside. Cash, electronics, passports, jewelry, the valuables that cruisers carry because they don't have bank accounts in every country they visit. Targeting a cruising boat isn't complicated. You don't need inside information. You don't need sophisticated planning. You just need to know the boat is there. Know it's isolated, and know no one is coming to help. 4 men walked down the dock just after midnight. They didn't hide. They didn't creep. They walked like they had a right to be there. Like they were part of the landscape. Like they belonged. They reached Magnetic Attraction and climbed aboard. Not quietly. Not carefully. Just climbed aboard. The sound of footsteps on the deck is distinctive. It's not the sound of rigging moving in the wind. It's not the sound of something shifting below. It's deliberate. Human. Wrong. Roger woke first. He was a light sleeper. Years of standing watch had trained him to notice changes. He heard the footsteps and knew immediately something was off. He got up, pulled on clothes, moved toward the companionway. Margaret was awake now too, sitting up in the berth, asking what was happening. Roger told her to stay below. He'd check it out. That's the instinct, the protective instinct, to put yourself between your partner and the unknown, to assess the situation before involving them, to believe on some level that you can manage it. But this wasn't a dragging anchor. This wasn't a loose halyard banging in the wind. This was 4 men who had already decided that Roger Pratt's life was worth less than whatever they could take from his boat. Roger came topside and found them already on deck. 4 men. Young. Maybe in their 20s. Maybe younger. It's hard to know. The details blur when violence happens fast. There was no conversation. No demand to hand over valuables. No attempt at negotiation. Just immediate, brutal violence. They hit him. Not once, not twice, multiple times. With fists, with something heavy. They hit him in the head. They hit him until he couldn't stand. Until he couldn't defend himself. Until he was just a body, an obstacle, something in the way of what they wanted. Margaret heard the sounds. The shouting. The impact. The chaos. She came topside. Not because she thought she could help, but because staying below, not knowing, was worse than facing it. And that's when they threw him overboard. Not gently, not carefully. They didn't lower him over the side. They threw him. Like cargo. Like something that didn't matter. Roger Pratt hit the water hard. The black water. The cold water. The water that was 3 feet from the dock, but might as well have been miles. He was injured, disoriented, bleeding. And the men who had beaten him didn't look back. They turned to Margaret. Margaret Pratt was 60 years old. She wasn't young. She wasn't strong. She was alone on a boat with 4 men who had just thrown her husband into the ocean. The math was simple. The outcome was inevitable. They hurt her too. Not as badly as Roger, but badly enough. She bled. She screamed. She fought in the way anyone fights when they know it's pointless, but can't stop themselves from trying. And then, just as suddenly as they'd arrived, they left. They took things. Electronics, probably. Cash if they could find it. Whatever they could carry. But they didn't stay long. The whole attack, from boarding to departure, probably lasted less than 10 minutes. 10 minutes. That's all it took to destroy 2 lives. They climbed off the boat and disappeared into the night. Back down the dock. Back into the town. Back into the anonymity of Vieux Fort, where 4 young men walking at midnight weren't unusual, weren't suspicious, weren't memorable. Margaret was left alone, bleeding, terrified, and suddenly horribly aware that Roger was in the water. She stumbled to the rail, called his name, shouted it, screamed it into the darkness. Roger! 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 The water didn't answer. There's a particular kind of silence that comes after violence. It's not peaceful. It's not restful. It's the silence of shock, of disbelief, of the brain trying to process what just happened, and failing. Margaret searched the water. She had a flashlight. Maybe, or maybe she just used the dock lights. The details aren't clear. What is clear is that she looked. She called. She refused to believe he was gone. And then she saw him, floating, face down, not far from the boat. Close enough that she could see him. Too far to reach. His body moving slightly with the current. Still, unresponsive, dead. Roger Pratt had drowned. The head injuries from the beating had likely incapacitated him. Maybe he was unconscious when he hit the water. Maybe he tried to swim and couldn't. Maybe he called for help and no one heard. The autopsy would later confirm blunt force trauma and drowning. But in that moment, all Margaret knew was that her husband was floating in the water and she couldn't save him. She screamed. She called for help. She didn't know what else to do. Eventually, someone heard. Someone called the authorities. Someone came. But by then, it was too late. Roger Pratt was dead. Margaret was traumatized. And Magnetic Attraction, the boat they'd poured everything into, the dream they'd built together, was now a crime scene. The St. Lucia police arrived. They pulled Roger's body from the water. They took statements from Margaret, though she was barely coherent. They secured the boat. They began an investigation. And to their credit, they did investigate. This wasn't a case they ignored or swept under the rug. Within days, they had made arrests. 4 young men from Vieux Fort. Suspects. The right age, the right area, the right profile. It looked, for a moment, like justice might happen. Like the system might work. Like Roger's death wouldn't just be another statistic, another cruiser killed in a foreign port, another story that other sailors would whisper about in marinas. But justice is complicated, especially in a small island nation with limited resources, limited infrastructure, and a legal system stretched thin. The evidence was collected: DNA samples, fingerprints, physical evidence from the boat, and from the suspects. It should have been straightforward. Match the DNA to the suspects. Build the case. Move to trial. But the DNA was contaminated. Somewhere in the collection process, in the handling, in the storage, something went wrong. The samples were compromised. The chain of custody was broken. The evidence that should have been definitive became questionable. And in a criminal case, questionable evidence is often useless evidence. The case stalled. Months passed, then years. The suspects were released. Not acquitted, not exonerated, just released. The prosecution couldn't move forward without the DNA. The defense argued the contamination proved reasonable doubt. The wheels of justice ground slower and slower until they stopped moving at all. Margaret Pratt was left in limbo. Her husband was dead. The men who killed him were walking free. And the boat, the dream, the life they'd built was gone. She eventually returned to England. She sold Magnetic Attraction. Or maybe it was seized. The details blur. What matters is that the boat, like the dream, was over. And the worst part? The cruelest part. They were supposed to leave the day before. The paperwork was the only thing that kept them there. A bureaucratic delay. A form that wasn't filed correctly. A system that didn't care about urgency or safety, or the fact that every extra night in a transitional port was a roll of the dice. The sea didn't kill Roger Pratt. The storm didn't kill him. The boat didn't fail. The dream didn't fail. A customs delay killed him. And 4 men who saw an opportunity and took it. The confrontation on the deck of Magnetic Attraction lasted minutes. Maybe 5. Maybe less. Violence has a way of compressing time, of making seconds feel like hours, and hours feel like nothing at all. But the actual sequence of events, the physical assault, the beating, the moment Roger Pratt's body hit the water, all of that happened fast. Roger wasn't a fighter. He was an engineer, a problem solver, a man who believed that most conflicts could be resolved through communication, through reason, through finding common ground. He'd spent his life building things, fixing things, making systems work. Violence wasn't part of his vocabulary. But when 4 men board your boat in the middle of the night, reason doesn't apply. Communication doesn't happen. You're not solving a problem. You're facing pure aggression, pure intent, and there's no engineering your way out of it. The first blow probably stunned him. Maybe he tried to speak, to ask what they wanted, to offer them money or valuables or anything that would make them leave. But they weren't there to negotiate. They were there to take. And Roger, simply by being present, by being awake, by coming topside, had made himself an obstacle. So they removed the obstacle. The blows came fast. To the head. To the body. Roger tried to defend himself. He raised his arms. He tried to back away. But there were 4 of them, and 1 of him. And the deck of a 41-foot boat doesn't offer much room to retreat. He went down. Not immediately, but eventually. The human body can only take so much impact before it stops responding. Before the brain can't process the signals anymore. Before survival instinct gives way to collapse. And then they lifted him, or dragged him, or just pushed him. The exact mechanics don't matter. What matters is that Roger Pratt, conscious or unconscious, injured and bleeding, went over the side. The sound of a body hitting water is distinct. It's not a splash. It's heavier than that. More final. The water takes you in with a kind of terrible completeness. And then the surface closes over, and it's like you were never there. Margaret heard it. She was still below, still trying to process what was happening, still caught in that horrible space between sleep and waking where nothing makes sense. She heard Roger's voice, heard the shouting, heard the impacts, and then she heard the water. That's when she moved. Not because she had a plan, not because she thought she could fight off 4 men, but because staying below, hiding, waiting, that was unbearable. Whatever was happening up there, she had to see it. She had to know. She came up the companionway and saw them. 4 shapes in the darkness. Young men. Moving fast. Grabbing things. One of them turned when he heard her. Saw her. And in that moment, Margaret understood that she was in danger too. She didn't scream. Not yet. The scream would come later. In that moment, she was too shocked, too disoriented, too focused on trying to understand what had just happened to Roger. One of the men moved toward her. She backed up. He grabbed her. She fought. Not effectively. Not in any way that would stop him. But she fought because that's what you do. Because surrender, even when it's rational, feels impossible. He hit her, maybe more than once. She bled. Later, the medical reports would document contusions, lacerations, injuries consistent with assault. But in that moment, all she knew was pain and fear, and the certainty that Roger was gone. The men took what they wanted. They ransacked the cabin, pulling out electronics, searching for cash, grabbing anything that looked valuable. They worked fast. They'd done this before. Or if they hadn't, they'd thought about it enough to know exactly what to look for and where cruisers usually kept it. And then they left. Just climbed back off the boat and disappeared into the night. No final words, no threats, no acknowledgement that they'd just destroyed 2 lives. They just left. Margaret was alone. The first thing she did was go to the rail. She had to see, had to know, had to confirm what she already understood but couldn't accept. She called his name, Roger, shouted it. The name she'd said 10,000 times over 40 years of marriage. The name that meant safety, partnership, home. She shouted it into the darkness, and the darkness gave nothing back. She found a flashlight. Her hands were shaking. Blood was dripping from somewhere on her face or her arm. She wasn't sure. It didn't matter. She aimed the light at the water and searched. The beam caught movement. Something pale, something floating. Roger! He was face down, drifting slightly with the current, not far from the boat, maybe 15 feet, close enough that in daylight, in calm conditions, someone could have swum to him, could have reached him, could have pulled him back. But it was dark, and Margaret was injured. And Roger wasn't moving. She called to him anyway, as if sound could wake the dead, as if volume could reverse what had already happened, as if the universe might, just this once, rewind the last 10 minutes and give them back. Roger didn't respond. She tried to reach him, leaned over the rail as far as she could. But the boat was tied to the dock, not floating free, and the angle was wrong. He was too far out. And even if she could reach him, even if she could grab his clothing or his arm, she didn't have the strength to pull a grown man's dead weight out of the water and onto the deck. So she screamed. Not his name this time. Just screamed. A sound that came from somewhere deeper than language. A sound that meant help and grief and rage all at once. Someone must have heard. Or maybe someone had already called the police when they heard the commotion. Or maybe it was just chance. But eventually, people came. The response time is unclear. Reports vary. Some accounts say it was minutes. Others suggest it was longer. Time is elastic in trauma. What feels like hours might be minutes. What feels like seconds might stretch on forever. But eventually, the St. Lucia police arrived. Officers came down the dock, flashlights sweeping the scene. They found Margaret bleeding, hysterical, pointing at the water. They found Roger floating near the boat. They called for medical assistance, for backup, for whatever resources the View Force Station could muster in the middle of the night. They pulled Roger's body from the water. It's not clear who did it. A police diver, maybe, or just officers with a boat hook and a lot of effort. The mechanics of body recovery are grim and practical, and not the kind of thing that gets detailed in official reports. Roger Pratt was dead. That much was obvious. The head injuries were visible. The fact that he'd been in the water, unconscious or semi-conscious, meant drowning was likely. But the cause of death would need to be confirmed by autopsy. The how and the why would need to be documented. The legal machinery had to start turning. Margaret was taken to the hospital. She needed treatment for her injuries. She needed to be examined, documented, photographed. Her wounds would become evidence. Her blood would be tested. Her trauma would be recorded in medical language that stripped away the emotional reality and left only the clinical facts. But more than treatment, she needed to give a statement. The police needed to know what happened. Who did this? What they looked like? What they took? Any detail that might help identify them. Margaret told them what she could. 4 men, young, local accents. They'd boarded the boat just after midnight. They'd beaten Roger and thrown him overboard. They'd assaulted her. They'd stolen electronics, cash, whatever they could find. She didn't know their names, didn't recognize them, had never seen them before. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start. Vieux Fort isn't a large town. The population is around 5,000 people. Everyone knows everyone, or knows someone who knows everyone. When a crime happens, especially a violent crime involving foreigners, word spreads fast. The police had a description. Young men, 4 of them, operating in the port area around midnight. They started asking questions, checking alibis, talking to informants, doing the work that small-town policing requires. And within 48 hours, they had suspects. 4 young men from the area. The right age, known to police. Not necessarily for violent crime, but for petty theft. For hanging around the docks. For being part of the landscape in a way that made them visible, but not quite criminal. The police brought them in, interviewed them, took DNA samples, fingerprints, photographs, built a case. The suspects denied involvement. That's standard. But the denials were weak, inconsistent. The kind of denials that investigators recognize as evasion rather than truth. The police felt confident. They had suspects. They had physical evidence from the boat. They had Margaret's testimony. They had a timeline. They had everything they needed to move forward. For a brief moment, it looked like the system would work. Like justice, even in a small Caribbean island with limited resources, would be served. Like Roger Pratt's death wouldn't just disappear into the void of unsolved crimes and forgotten victims. Margaret, still in shock, still processing the fact that her husband was dead and her life was shattered, allowed herself a small measure of hope. Not that it would bring Roger back. Nothing could do that. But that the men who killed him would be held accountable. That there would be consequences. That the world would acknowledge that what happened to them was wrong. But hope is fragile. And the justice system, even when it tries, is imperfect. The evidence collection began immediately. The boat was a crime scene. Police photographers documented everything. The deck where Roger was beaten. The companionway where Margaret was assaulted. The cabin where the men had searched for valuables. Blood spatter, fingerprints, DNA. DNA evidence is powerful. It's objective. It doesn't lie. You can't argue with a genetic match. If the suspect's DNA was on the boat, in the blood, on the objects they touched, the case was solid. But DNA evidence is also delicate. It requires careful collection. Proper storage, a maintained chain of custody. You can't just grab samples and throw them in a bag. You need sterile containers, proper labeling, temperature control, documentation at every step. Somewhere in that process, something went wrong. Maybe it was the heat. St. Lucia is tropical. Crime scene evidence, if not stored properly, can degrade fast. Maybe the samples weren't refrigerated quickly enough. Maybe they were left in a vehicle too long. Maybe the storage facility didn't have proper climate control. Or maybe it was contamination. Someone touched the samples without gloves. Or used the same tools for multiple samples without sterilizing them. Or allowed the evidence to come into contact with other materials. Or maybe it was just documentation. Maybe the chain of custody wasn't maintained properly. Maybe someone forgot to log when they moved the samples, or who had access to them, or where they were stored. The why doesn't matter. What matters is the result. When the DNA evidence was analyzed, it was compromised. The samples were contaminated. The results were inconclusive. Without solid DNA evidence, the case weakened. It didn't collapse. Margaret's testimony still stood. The timeline still made sense. The suspects were still the most likely perpetrators. But reasonable doubt had crept in. And in a criminal case, reasonable doubt is fatal. The legal process dragged on. Months turned into a year. A year turned into 2. The suspects were released on bail. They returned to their lives. They walked the same streets. Probably saw each other. Probably talked about what happened. Probably knew they were going to get away with it. Margaret couldn't stay. St. Lucia, the island that had seemed like paradise, was now the place where her husband was murdered. Every street reminded her. Every official interaction brought it back. Every day she spent there was a day spent waiting for a justice system that was moving slower than she could bear. She returned to England, to family, to a life that no longer made sense. The house was gone. The boat was gone. Roger was gone. Everything they'd built together had evaporated in one night of violence. She tried to keep track of the case from abroad, tried to stay in contact with the St. Lucia authorities, tried to push for progress. But distance makes everything harder. And the legal system in St. Lucia was already stretched thin. This was one case among many. A tragedy, yes, but not the only tragedy, not the only unsolved crime, not the only family waiting for justice. The case stalled, then effectively stopped. The suspects were never formally acquitted, but they were never convicted either. They simply faded back into the landscape of Vieux Fort. Free men. Men who had beaten a 62-year-old engineer and thrown him into the ocean to drown. Men who had assaulted his wife and ransacked their home. Men who had destroyed 2 lives for electronics and cash. Margaret Pratt was left with nothing. No husband. No justice. No closure. Just the knowledge that Roger's death had been meaningless, random, and ultimately unpunished. And the final cruelty? They were supposed to leave the day before. The body she found floating in the water wasn't just her husband. It was the end of everything. The dream they'd shared, the life they'd built, the future they'd planned. All of it ended the moment Roger Pratt hit the water. She searched in the darkness, called his name, watched as the flashlight beam caught his pale skin, his clothes, the terrible stillness of a body that was no longer inhabited. She reached for him and couldn't. She screamed for him and he didn't answer. She waited for help and it came too late. Roger Pratt drowned in 3 feet of water, 15 feet from his own boat with his wife watching. He drowned because 4 men decided his life was worth less than a laptop and some cash. He drowned because a customs form wasn't processed on time. He drowned because he was in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in a port that existed in the gap between security and chaos. Margaret never sailed again. Magnetic Attraction was sold or seized. The reports aren't clear. The dream died with Roger, and the men who killed him walked free. That's the story. That's what happened, and that's why it matters. The arrests happened quickly. That part worked. Within 2 days of Roger Pratt's death, the St. Lucia police had 4 suspects in custody. Young men, local, the right profile, the right connections to the port area. The kind of people who would know when a foreign boat was sitting vulnerable at a commercial dock. For Margaret, still in shock, still bleeding, still trying to process the fact that her husband was dead, the arrests brought a flicker of something. Not hope exactly. Hope was too strong a word, but maybe the possibility of acknowledgement. The possibility that the system would recognize what had been done to them. That consequences would follow. That Roger's death wouldn't just dissolve into the Caribbean night like it had never happened. The police worked the case. They interviewed the suspects. They collected evidence from the boat. They took DNA samples, fingerprints, photographs. They built timelines. They cross-referenced alibis. They did the work that investigations require, even in a small island nation with limited resources and too many cases competing for attention. The suspects denied everything. That's standard procedure. You deny until the evidence makes denial impossible. And even then, you keep denying. You claim mistaken identity. You claim you were somewhere else. You claim the evidence is wrong, the witnesses are lying, the system is biased. But the police felt they had a case. They had Margaret's testimony. They had physical evidence from the boat. They had the suspect's own inconsistencies. And they had DNA. DNA was the linchpin. If the DNA from the crime scene matched the suspects, the case was solid. Testimony can be questioned. Physical evidence can be disputed. But genetic markers don't lie. You can't argue with a double helix. So they sent the samples to the lab, and they waited. The contamination wasn't discovered immediately. These things take time. The samples have to be processed. The analysis has to be run. The results have to be verified. And then someone has to notice that something is wrong. When they did notice, it wasn't dramatic. No alarm bells, no emergency meetings. Just a quiet note in a lab report. Contamination detected. Sample integrity compromised. Results inconclusive. In the language of forensic science, those words are damning. Contamination means the sample came into contact with something it shouldn't have. Another sample, environmental DNA, biological material from someone handling the evidence. Anything that muddies the genetic signature and makes it impossible to definitively match suspect to crime scene. Inconclusive means useless. It means you can't use the evidence in court. It means the strongest piece of your case just evaporated. The prosecution tried to salvage it. They reviewed the collection procedures. They checked the chain of custody. They looked for ways to explain the contamination that wouldn't undermine the entire case. Maybe it was environmental. Maybe it was a known issue that could be accounted for. Maybe there were other samples that were still clean. But forensic evidence doesn't work on maybes. It works on certainty. And once contamination is detected, certainty is gone. The defense attorney saw the opening and drove straight through it. They filed motions. They challenged the evidence. They argued that the contamination proved the entire investigation was sloppy, that the police had rushed to judgment, that their clients were being railroaded by a system more interested in closing the case than finding the truth. None of that was accurate. But it didn't have to be. It just had to create reasonable doubt. And it did. The case didn't collapse all at once. It died slowly, by inches, by procedural delays and evidentiary challenges and legal maneuvering that stretched months into years. The suspects remained free on bail. They walked the streets of Vieux-Fort. They went about their lives. They weren't in prison. They weren't facing trial. They were just waiting, like everyone else, for a legal system that had ground to a halt. Margaret tried to stay engaged. She communicated with the prosecutors. She asked for updates. She pushed for progress. But she was doing it from England, from thousands of miles away, from a position of complete powerlessness. She couldn't compel the lab to retest the samples. She couldn't force the prosecutors to move faster. She couldn't make the justice system care as much as she did. All she could do was wait and hope and watch as the case slowly bled out. By the third year, it was effectively over. The suspects were never formally acquitted. But the prosecution couldn't move forward. The evidence was too weak. The contamination issue was too significant. The likelihood of conviction was too low. So the case just stopped. Not with a verdict, not with a declaration of innocence. It just stopped moving. Frozen in bureaucratic limbo. Officially open, practically closed. The men who killed Roger Pratt were free. Not because they were proven innocent. Not because the evidence exonerated them, but because the system couldn't overcome its own failures. Margaret was left with nothing but certainty. She knew what had happened. She'd been there. She'd seen the men. She'd heard Roger hit the water. She'd found his body floating in the darkness. She knew. But knowing isn't justice. And justice, it turned out, wasn't coming. The contamination was a technical failure, but it represented something larger. It represented the gap between what small island nations need and what they can afford, between the ideal of justice and the reality of limited resources. St. Lucia's population is around 180,000 people. The entire island. The police force is small. The forensic capabilities are limited. There's no local DNA lab. Samples have to be sent off-island. To Trinidad, maybe, or to the United Kingdom. Somewhere with the equipment and expertise to process them properly. That creates delays. It creates opportunities for contamination. It creates chain of custody issues when evidence has to be transported across international borders. It creates dependencies on systems that aren't designed for the unique challenges of small island policing. This isn't unique to St. Lucia. It's a problem across the Caribbean. Across small nations everywhere, you have the legal framework for justice. You have laws against murder, against assault, against robbery. You have courts and judges and prosecutors who understand the law and want to enforce it. But you don't have the infrastructure. You don't have the labs. You don't have the specialists. You don't have the budget to process every piece of evidence with the same rigor that a major metropolitan police force could bring to bear. So evidence gets contaminated, cases stall, guilty people walk free, and victims like Margaret Pratt are left with the knowledge that justice failed, not because the system didn't care, but because it simply couldn't deliver. That's a different kind of tragedy. Not malice, not corruption, just limitation. Margaret eventually stopped calling, stopped emailing, stopped checking for updates, not because she didn't care, but because caring was destroying her. Every day spent waiting for justice was a day spent reliving Roger's death. Every update, or lack of update, was a reminder that he was gone and nothing would bring him back. She tried to rebuild some kind of life. But how do you rebuild when the foundation is gone? When your partner of 40 years is dead? When the dream you'd spent a decade planning ended in violence and chaos and bureaucratic failure? She couldn't go back to cruising. The thought of being on a boat, any boat, brought it all back. The sound of footsteps on deck. Roger's voice. The splash. The searching. The terrible moment of finding him and knowing there was nothing she could do. She couldn't talk about it easily. People wanted to know what happened. They'd heard she'd been cruising. They'd heard Roger had died. They asked questions with good intentions. But every question was a wound reopened. Every explanation required her to relive the worst night of her life. So she stopped explaining, stopped sharing, became private in her grief. The woman who had planned to sail the world became the woman who stayed home and tried not to think about what she'd lost. And the boat? Magnetic Attraction was sold. The exact circumstances aren't clear from public records. Maybe Margaret sold it. Maybe it was seized as evidence and later auctioned. Maybe the legal limbo of the case made ownership complicated. But it doesn't matter. The boat was gone, just like Roger. Just like the dream. Just like everything they'd built together. 41 feet of steel. Built to survive oceans. Built to cross the world. Built to be a home on the water. Reduced to a crime scene. Then reduced to a transaction. Then gone. The vulnerability of cruisers isn't theoretical. It's structural. Built into the very nature of what they're doing. When you're cruising, you're operating in a strange legal space. You're not quite a tourist. You're not quite a resident. You're a visitor with a vehicle that happens to be your home. You move between jurisdictions. You're subject to different laws in every port. You have limited legal standing and limited recourse when things go wrong. You're also visibly wealthy, even if you're not. Even if you scraped together every penny to buy an old boat and live cheaply. The fact that you own a boat at all, the fact that you're sailing for pleasure rather than working, marks you as someone with resources. And you're isolated. The super yachts have crews. They have security systems. They have satellite communications and armed guards and panic rooms. They operate in a completely different universe. But the couple on the 40-foot cruiser, they're alone. Two people, maybe elderly, maybe not physically strong, sitting on a boat filled with electronics and cash and passports and everything else they need to survive in foreign countries. They're targets, not because they're foolish, not because they're naive, but because the math is simple. High value, low security, isolated location, easy access. And the ports themselves often exist in gray zones. Tourist marinas have security. They have gates and guards and cameras. They're expensive, but they're safe. Commercial ports like Vieux-Fort have activity. They have workers and cargo and movement. But they don't have dedicated security for visiting yachts. They're not designed for that. They're designed for commercial traffic, for fishing boats, for cargo vessels. So cruisers end up in these transitional spaces. Places that feel safe because they're not empty, but places that aren't actually safe because no one is responsible for protecting them. Roger and Margaret knew this. They weren't naive. They'd been cruising for years. They'd heard the stories. They'd read the warnings. They'd taken precautions. But precautions don't stop determined attackers. And the one precaution that would have saved them, leaving St. Lucia on schedule, was taken out of their hands by bureaucracy. The bureaucratic delay is the detail that makes this story unbearable. It's the detail that shifts this from a random act of violence to a preventable tragedy. Roger and Margaret were ready to leave. The boat was prepared. The weather was good. The route was planned. They'd done everything right. They'd followed all the procedures. They'd checked in with customs, declared their intentions, filled out the paperwork. But the paperwork wasn't processed. Some form was missing. Some stamp was needed. Some official wasn't available. The exact reason doesn't matter. What matters is that they were told they couldn't leave. Not that it was inadvisable. Not that it would be risky, but that they legally could not leave. That if they tried, they'd be in violation of St. Lucia's customs regulations. That they'd face fines or detention or seizure of their vessel. So they stayed. They did what law-abiding people do. They waited for the system to process their paperwork. They followed the rules. And following the rules killed Roger Pratt. If the paperwork had been processed on time, they would have left. They would have sailed north to Martinique or south to St. Vincent. They would have anchored in a different bay on a different night in a different place. They would have continued their journey. They would have lived. But bureaucracy is slow. Bureaucracy is indifferent. Bureaucracy doesn't care that every extra night in a transitional port increases risk. Bureaucracy doesn't care that people are waiting, vulnerable, exposed. Bureaucracy just processes forms. When it gets around to it. This is the nightmare scenario that cruisers talk about, but don't really believe will happen to them. They read the stories. They hear the warnings. They see the posts on cruising forums about attacks in various ports. They nod and take note and maybe avoid certain anchorages, but they don't really internalize it. Because if you internalized every risk, you'd never leave the dock. You'd never cross an ocean. You'd never anchor in a foreign port. You'd never live the dream. So you accept the risk. You take precautions. You stay in well-lit anchorages. You keep the VHF on. You lock the companionway when you go ashore. You trust that most people are good, that most ports are safe, that violence is the exception rather than the rule. And you're right. Most of the time. Most cruisers sail for years without incident. They have wonderful experiences. They meet kind people. They anchor in beautiful places. They live the dream fully and safely, and return home with stories and photographs and memories. But Roger and Margaret were the exception. They were the statistical outlier. The ones who rolled the dice one too many times. The ones who ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the cruelest part is that it wasn't even their choice. They didn't choose to stay in Vieux Fort. They were forced to stay by a system that didn't care about their safety, by a customs procedure that valued paperwork over people. The sea didn't kill Roger Pratt. The storm didn't kill him. The boat didn't fail. His own judgment didn't fail. A bureaucratic delay kept him in place. And 4 men who saw an opportunity took it. That's the horror. Not that the ocean is dangerous. We know the ocean is dangerous. We accept that risk when we set sail. The horror is that the land, the civilization, the systems we build to create order and safety and justice, those systems can kill you just as surely as any storm. By being slow, by being indifferent, by creating the conditions where violence can flourish. Roger Pratt built a boat to cross oceans. He prepared for heavy weather, for equipment failure, for everything the sea could throw at him. He engineered solutions. He planned for contingencies. He did everything right, but he couldn't engineer his way out of bureaucracy. He couldn't plan for a contaminated DNA sample. He couldn't solve for a justice system that would ultimately fail his widow. He died waiting for permission to leave, and the men who killed him died waiting for nothing. That's the nightmare. That's the story. That's why it matters. Because the next couple sitting in a commercial port, waiting for customs clearance, waiting for paperwork to process, waiting for permission to continue their journey, they're Roger and Margaret Pratt. They're living the dream. They're following the rules. They're doing everything right. And they're vulnerable. Not because they're foolish, not because they're unprepared, but because the systems that are supposed to protect them are slow and limited and indifferent. And in the gap between safety and bureaucracy, violence waits.